The provisions authorize the indefinite military detention of American citizens who are suspected of involvement in terrorism, even those captured here in our own country, in the United States, which I think should concern each and every one of us.
Their legislation would arm the military with the authority to detain indefinitely, without due process or trial, people suspected of an association with terrorism. These would include American citizens apprehended on American soil. I want to repeat that. We are talking about people who are merely suspected of terrorism or suspected of committing a crime and have been judged by no court. We are talking about American citizens that could be taken from the United States and sent to a camp at Guantanamo Bay and held indefinitely. This should be alarming to everyone watching this proceeding today, because it puts every single American citizen at risk. There is one thing and one thing only that is protecting American citizens, and that's our Constitution, the checks we put on government power. Should we err today and remove some of the most important checks on state power in the name of fighting terrorism, well, then the terrorists have won. Know good and well that someday there could be a government in power that is shipping its citizens off for disagreements. There are laws on the books now that characterize who might be a terrorist. Someone missing fingers on their hands is a suspect, according to the Department of Justice. Someone who has guns, someone who has ammunition that is weatherproofed, someone who has more than 7 days of food in their house can be considered a potential terrorist. If you are suspected by these activities, do you want to have the government have the ability to send you to Guantanamo Bay for indefinite detention? A suspect. We're not talking about someone who has been tried and found guilty. We're talking about someone suspected of activities.
In this instance, what we're talking about is the right of the U.S. military to detain indefinitely without trial a U.S. citizen simply on the basis that that person has been deemed an enemy combatant.
Under the provisions, would it be possible that an American citizen then could be declared an enemy combatant and sent to Guantanamo Bay and detained indefinitely?
I think that as long as that individual, no matter who they are, if they pose a threat to the security of the United States of America, should not be allowed to continue that threat.
And when they say, "I want my lawyer," you tell them, "Shut up.
Your time has
Get a lawyer."
Despite the best efforts of the Bush administration, the courts upheld the right of habeas corpus for American citizens, even for those accused of being terrorists. Our number one story, the National Defense Authorization Act once again seeks to revoke this right. And even though it is now an Obama administration, it seems likely that the bill will be signed. 2 weeks ago, we told you about the National Defense Authorization Act and the provisions that allowed for an indefinite detention of an American citizen without charges or trial, a bill the president threatened to veto at that time. Monday, the House and Senate Armed Services Committees came to agreement on a final version of the bill, and confidence was high that they'd made the changes necessary to get the president's signature.
Any rational observance of this legislation clearly is not anything that could damage America's national security.
Well, it doesn't damage America's national security. It does all but destroy habeas corpus, as the provisions for indefinite detention of American citizens still exists. In a statement, Senate Chairman Carl Levin explained the changes in the bill. We've changed the waiver provision so that waiver authority now rests with the president rather than the Secretary of Defense, so the military can still indefinitely detain someone, but the president can issue a waiver stopping them if he wishes, and it is civilian force like the FBI which has the authority to investigate and interrogate suspects being indefinitely detained. Both stipulations said to have been added at the request of the president.
Citizens was in the bill that we originally approved in the Armed Services Committee, and the administration asked us to remove the language which says that U.S. citizens and lawful residents would not be subject to this section. Is the senator familiar with the fact that it was the administration that asked us to remove the very language which we had in the bill which passed the committee, and that we removed it at the request of the administration, that would have said that this determination would not apply to U.S. citizens and lawful residents?
As feared, the administration announcing today the president will not veto a bill that allows American citizens to be indefinitely detained without trial on American soil if there is even a suspicion they might have ties to terrorists. In our third story tonight, the defense authorization bill passing the House early in the evening after the White House abandoned its threat to veto the legislation over provisions on terror suspects.
In the last 10 years, we have begun to let go of our freedoms, bit by bit, with each new executive order, court decision, and yes, act of Congress.
Civil liberties groups also condemning the administration today. Human Rights First President and CEO Elisa Massimino saying in a statement, the American people need a leader whose commitment to smart national security policies will not wane in the face of opposition from Capitol Hill. This legislation will be a loaded gun in the hands of any future administration. The ACLU's Laura Murphy saying Mr. Obama, quote, should more carefully consider the consequences of allowing this bill to become law. What on earth is the president doing on this?
Well, the president was talking about vetoing the bill, but only because he thought it limited his power. He was not talking about vetoing the bill because it gave the president the power to order the indefinite detention without trial of anybody, basically. And I think quite clearly does that. Now, some people on the floor said today that all it does is codify existing law, but that's not correct. What it does is to codify in law the claimed power claimed by Presidents Bush and Obama to put anybody, including American citizens, in jail forever, indefinitely, without any trial or due process whatsoever. That's quite a terrible blow to American liberty.
I don't think we can completely avoid, or we certainly should not avoid, the issues of civil liberties. I mean, look at if any American could be named an enemy combatant, well, what's the limit of civil? I mean, there are no civil liberties left potentially, and I think most Americans, though, Keith, have not focused on this. I mean, people are so worried about their jobs and their wages, they're not really paying attention to much of the rest of it.
The National Defense Authorization Act is a piece of legislation passed annually that authorizes funding of our military activities worldwide. What makes this year's passage of the act so monumentally disturbing is the deplorable and downright sneaky language that has been authored into the bill by Senators John McCain, a Republican, and Carl Levin, a Democrat. This frightening language, carefully crafted into sections 1031 and 1032, is being labeled as a fascist and totalitarian assault on the Bill of Rights, which has prompted the call for immediate resignation of both McCain and Levin by constitutional law experts, military personnel, and everyday citizens alike. It is being called the most traitorous act in the history of the Senate, and while the language has been cleverly manipulated to appear almost benign, authorities in constitutional law claim that the threat posed to the rights of American citizens is very real indeed. This bill's controversial language extends the U.S. military's power to detain U.S. citizens on U.S. soil without even ever filing charges. They can then be detained in secret military prisons such as Guantanamo indefinitely without any due process or opportunity for a trial by jury. Our own tax-funded military would be granted unchecked power to arrest, detain, interrogate, and even assassinate any U.S. citizen they deem as a threat with total impunity. In other words, the instantaneous creation of a military police state within our own borders. I know it sounds almost unbelievable, but if you think that I'm making this up, here is what Craig Paul Roberts, a former Reagan administration official, had to say about it on RT America.
Which permits the United States government to use the military in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, which has been in place since 1876, and to use the military to arrest American citizens and hold them in indefinite detention with no recourse to courts of law. Now, this constitutes the repeal of the United States Constitution. And when you find that we have 60 members of the elected Congress who have supported this, then what we see is the United States is on its way to being a police state.
This story should be the most talked about issue in the news today, yet most Americans remain oblivious to the fact that Congress is voting to snatch up all of our rights in the middle of the night, quietly and secretly destroying our liberties of free speech and trial by jury.
The Holocaust is generally deemed to be the worst travesty in human history. 5 or 6 million Jews. I don't know what the actual count was, but it was a lot of people. They did a genocide. They tried to wipe out an entire race. Hitler did not take Germany by force. He did not drive in with army tanks. Hitler was elected. Everybody voted for Hitler because he was going to solve all their economic problems. Did Hitler get elected on Monday and start throwing people into ovens on Friday? No. It was a gradual process. The first thing that Hitler did was start to write newspaper articles. Everything that was going wrong was the Jews' fault. They're the ones that caused all these problems. Did the Jews write their own newspaper articles and go, I disagree? Well, not that I can think of. I've never read any newspaper articles that, contradicted any of that. So then the Jews had to wear the Star of David so that we can tell who you are. Did they say, no, that's a violation of my privacy. I don't have to tell you whether, I'm Jewish or not. No, the Jews decided, well, it's a religious symbol. We love God. We should be proud to wear the Star of David. Eventually, the Germans came in and they broke all of the windows in all of the Jewish businesses in one weekend. Saturday night was known as Kristallnacht, which is German for Night of Glass. You couldn't walk up and down the sidewalks because they were filled with glass. Did the Jews rise up and say, now, damn it, you're violating my property. You shouldn't do that? No. Gosh, we don't want to make the Germans any madder than they already are. We want to just kind of go along to get along. Don't piss them off. They've got guns. Eventually, the Germans are loading them up into cattle trailers on the train. Where do you think you're going? On vacation? Where do you think they're going to take you? Well, now you're cold and naked and they're walking you into the ovens where you're going to go to mass execution. Is it time now to raise your hand and say, I tend to disagree with all of this? Bang! You're dead. It's too late to complain. You should have complained at the beginning when you at least had a chance. My question to you, and I don't expect you to answer it, just think about it in your head. How bad do things have to get before you do something? Do they have to be throwing you on cattle cars before you start to say, now wait a minute, I don't think this is a good idea? How long is it going to be before you finally resist and say no? That's a different answer for each person. Ask yourself now, because sooner or later you're going to come to that line, and when they cross it, what are you going to say? Well, okay, cross this line. Okay, now cross that line. Okay, now cross this line. And pretty soon you're in a corner. Sooner or later, you've got to draw a line and stand your ground, whether anybody else does or not. That is what liberty is all about.